My beloved child. There is a kind of surprise that does not arrive with flowers at the door, a knock in the middle of the night, or a message that suddenly appears after months of silence. Sometimes the sweetest surprise begins much earlier. It begins quietly, while you are still convinced that nothing is changing. You go about your days carrying the same thoughts you have carried for so long. You answer people when they speak to you. You smile when you are expected to smile. You keep certain memories in places you rarely visit anymore because opening them feels like disturbing something that never received a proper ending. And somewhere inside all of that ordinary life, someone may be remembering you too. Not perfectly. Not romantically every second of the day. Not as some flawless person who has suddenly understood every mistake they ever made. Just as a human being remembers another human being when something small brings them back. A song. A familiar sentence. A place they once passed without thinking. The way someone laughs. The empty chair across from them. A photograph they almost deleted. And perhaps that is why you have felt something difficult to explain lately. Not certainty. Not proof. Just a strange tenderness around the edges of your life, as though your heart knows that a chapter has not finished saying what it came to say. You may have told yourself to stop expecting anything. That was probably wise. Expectations can make the heart tired. So you stopped checking. You stopped wondering whether your phone would light up. You stopped imagining footsteps outside your door. You stopped rehearsing conversations that might never happen. And because you stopped waiting in the obvious way, you never noticed that something had begun moving in a different direction. The story began on an ordinary evening. You had not planned anything special. There was no reason to believe that the night would become one of those memories you would carry for years. You were tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes immediately, but the deeper kind that comes from having spent too long trying to make peace with something you still did not understand. You had learned how to live around the unanswered questions. That was different from having answers. There was a difference between healing and forgetting, and somewhere along the way you had discovered it. You could think about the past without falling apart. You could hear a familiar name without feeling the entire room become smaller. You could remember what happened without immediately asking what might have happened if one person had been braver. You had reached a place where the memory still mattered, but it no longer controlled every decision you made. That night, you were doing something ordinary when you noticed an old photograph. You almost ignored it. It was tucked beneath several other things, the kind of object that had survived not because you deliberately preserved it, but because you had never found a reason to throw it away. You picked it up. For a moment, you simply looked. There you were. Younger. Softer somehow. Before you had learned certain lessons. Before you had discovered how easily two people can love each other and still hurt each other. Before you understood that timing can become its own kind of heartbreak. And there, beside you, was the person you had once wondered about more times than you could count. You did not stare at the photograph for long. That surprised you. Once, you would have searched every expression for meaning. You would have remembered what was said that day, what was not said, what happened afterward. But now you only smiled faintly. Not because everything had become beautiful. Because it had become part of you. You placed the photograph back. Then you noticed something behind it. A folded piece of paper. You frowned. You did not remember putting it there. When you opened it, you recognized the handwriting immediately. Your heart did not race. It simply became still. There are moments when the body understands something before the mind catches up. You knew that handwriting. You had seen it on little notes, old messages, envelopes, pages covered with hurried thoughts. You unfolded the paper carefully. There were only a few lines. And the first sentence was enough to make you sit down. It was not a declaration of love. It was not an apology. It was not even an attempt to ask you to come back. It was something much stranger. Someone had written that they had found something they thought you had forgotten. And they wanted to return it to you. You read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Because suddenly you remembered. Years ago, you had lost something small. Something that had meant much more than its material value. You had searched everywhere for it. You had mentioned it once. Then again. Eventually, you stopped. You assumed it was gone. You never knew that the other person had found it. You never knew they had kept it. And you certainly never imagined that, all this time later, they still had it. You held the note in your hand and felt a strange mixture of tenderness and caution. Because the heart has a memory of its own. It remembers what happened after beautiful moments. It remembers how quickly hope can become disappointment. It remembers promises that sounded sincere when they were spoken and felt very different when they were broken. So you did not immediately turn this small discovery into a grand meaning. You did not tell yourself that destiny had finally arrived. You simply wondered why now. Why had they kept it? Why return it? Why write the note instead of sending a message? And most of all, why did the idea of seeing them again make you feel less afraid than you expected? You went to sleep that night with the note beside you. You did not know that somewhere else, another person was sitting with a different kind of fear. They had written that note several times. The first version was too long. They tore it up. The second sounded too apologetic. They tore that one up too. The third tried to explain everything. That frightened them. So they wrote less. They had spent years believing that if they ever came back into your life, they would need the perfect explanation. Eventually they understood that perfection was another form of avoidance. There would never be a sentence capable of making the past disappear. There would only be the truth. And the truth was uncomfortable. They had loved you. They had also been afraid of what loving you required from them. Those two things had existed together. They had wanted closeness and then become frightened by it. They had wanted to be understood while refusing to explain themselves. They had missed you and still remained silent. They had sometimes told themselves that leaving you alone was an act of kindness when, if they were honest, part of it was simply fear. Fear of being rejected. Fear of admitting they had been wrong. Fear that you had moved on. Fear that you had not. And perhaps the most painful fear of all was discovering that the version of you they had kept alive in their memory no longer existed. Because people change. You had changed. They had changed too. The person they remembered was real, but she or he belonged to a different chapter of your life. So they wondered whether they had any right to reopen the door. For a long time, they decided they did not. Then something happened. It was small. Almost insignificant. They were going through an old box when they found the thing they had kept. The object itself was ordinary. But the memory attached to it was not. They remembered the day you had lost it. They remembered the expression on your face when you realized it was gone. They remembered pretending not to care as much as you did because they did not know how to comfort you. And suddenly they remembered something else. You had once said, almost jokingly, that if anyone ever found it, they should return it even if years had passed. You probably forgot saying that. They never did. The sentence came back with such clarity that they had to sit down. That was when the surprise began. Not when they contacted you. Not when they found the object. Not even when they wrote the note. It began with a memory they had carried without understanding why. Sometimes the heart keeps a door unlocked long after the mind has stopped looking at it. They did not know whether you would open yours. They only knew they could no longer pretend they had never wanted to knock. The next morning, you found yourself thinking about the note again. You had not told anyone. You were not even sure why. Part of you wanted to protect the moment from other people's opinions. Because the moment another person hears about something like this, they may immediately give it a meaning. They might say, "This must be a sign." They might say, "They are coming back." They might say, "You were meant to be together." But you had learned to be careful with words like that. You wanted something more honest. You wanted to know what was real. So you waited. And when the message finally came, it did not say what you expected. There was no dramatic confession. No desperate paragraph. Only a simple question. Would you be willing to meet somewhere quiet? You looked at the screen for a long time. Then you put the phone down. You picked it up again. You typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. You realized something about yourself in that moment. You were not afraid of seeing them. You were afraid of what seeing them might reveal about you. What if the old feelings were still there? What if they were not? What if you had spent so much time believing the story was unfinished that you had forgotten how to imagine an ending? Eventually, you answered. Yes. One word. Nothing more. And yet that one word carried years inside it. The meeting was not romantic at first. That is important. Real life rarely gives people the perfect lighting, perfect words, and perfect timing that stories promise. There was awkwardness. There were pauses. There were moments when both of you looked somewhere else because eye contact suddenly felt too revealing. The other person arrived carrying the small object they had found. They placed it on the table between you. You recognized it immediately. Your fingers touched it. And for a moment, neither of you spoke. Then they smiled. I kept meaning to return this. You looked at them. For years? They lowered their eyes. I know. You almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes the truth is so absurd that laughter becomes the only way the heart can make room for it. You could have mailed it. I could have. Why didn't you? They took a breath. Because I knew it wasn't really about the object. That sentence stayed between you. You waited. They looked at you carefully. I think I was afraid that if I returned it, I would have to admit I still remembered everything. You could have asked what everything meant. You did not. You already knew. Instead, you touched the object again. It felt smaller than you remembered. That surprised you. You had carried its emotional weight for so long that you had forgotten how little it actually weighed in your hand. Perhaps that was the first thing the meeting gave you. Not reunion. Perspective. The past can become enormous when it lives only inside memory. Sometimes you have to hold an old piece of it again to realize how much of the weight came from everything you had attached to it. The conversation continued slowly. There were things they wanted to say. You could tell. But you did not make it easy for them. Not because you wanted to punish them. Because you had grown tired of doing the emotional work for two people. Once, you would have filled every silence. You would have asked the questions they were too frightened to answer. You would have explained their feelings for them. You would have made the conversation safe enough for them to avoid responsibility. You were different now. So you let the silence remain. Eventually, they spoke. I was not ready then. You looked at them. Ready for what? They hesitated. For the kind of love you were asking me to give. You felt something inside you loosen. Not because the sentence erased anything. It did not. But because it named something you had spent a long time blaming yourself for. You had once wondered whether you had asked for too much. Maybe you had been too emotional. Too hopeful. Too available. Too honest. Maybe you had wanted a kind of closeness that frightened them because there was something wrong with you. Now you understood. You had not necessarily been too much. They had simply been unable, at that time, to meet you where you stood. That did not make what happened acceptable. But understanding and excusing are not the same thing. You could understand someone's fear without allowing that fear to become your burden again. You could forgive without pretending nothing had happened. And they seemed to understand that. I know saying that doesn't fix anything, they said. No, you answered. I know. Another silence. Then they smiled faintly. I didn't bring you here to ask you to forget. You looked at them. Then why? They seemed almost embarrassed by the answer. Because I wanted to give you something I should have given you a long time ago. What? The truth. You waited. They told you things you had suspected and things you had never imagined. They told you about the nights they almost called. The messages they wrote and deleted. The times they heard something that reminded them of you and immediately changed the subject when someone noticed. They told you that they had sometimes checked whether you were doing well, not because they wanted to invade your life, but because some part of them still cared. They also admitted something harder. There had been periods when they did not think about you at all. And strangely, that honesty hurt less than a romantic lie would have. Because real love is not measured by how obsessively someone remembers you every hour. People have lives. People work. People laugh. People struggle. People move forward. The truth was not that you had occupied every corner of their mind. The truth was that even after life moved forward, something about you remained meaningful. That was different. And perhaps more beautiful. You listened. You did not interrupt. When they finished, you realized you had been holding your breath. Then you asked the question you had carried for years. Why didn't you come back sooner? They looked down. There was no dramatic answer. I thought you deserved someone who didn't have to be convinced to stay. That answer hurt. But not in the way you expected. Because beneath it was regret. They had not stayed away because you were unworthy. They had stayed away because they knew they had not yet become the person they wanted to be beside you. And maybe that had been part of the strange mercy of time. Sometimes distance is not proof that love was false. Sometimes distance reveals what love alone could not repair. You left that meeting without making promises. There was no immediate reconciliation. No declaration that everything would be different. You went home carrying the object they had returned and the conversation you had shared. For the first time in a long time, you did not feel the need to decide what it all meant. You allowed it to be unfinished. And that was its own kind of freedom. The next surprise came later. Not from them. From you. You woke one morning and realized you were no longer asking whether they would choose you. You were asking whether you would choose the life that existed beyond the old story. That question changed everything. Because love becomes healthier when it stops being a courtroom where someone must prove your worth. You no longer needed someone to return just to prove that you had been important. You no longer needed an apology to validate your pain. You no longer needed a reunion to make the past meaningful. The past already meant something. It had shaped you. It had taught you where you abandoned yourself trying to keep someone else. It had taught you the difference between patience and waiting indefinitely. It had taught you that forgiveness can exist alongside boundaries. And perhaps most importantly, it had taught you that being loved and being loved well are not always the same thing. A person can care deeply and still hurt you. A person can regret losing you and still not be ready to keep you. A person can return and still need to prove through actions that returning was not simply another emotional moment. You understood that now. And they did too. That is why the next chapter did not begin with promises. It began with small things. A message that did not demand anything. A conversation that did not become an argument. An apology followed by changed behavior. An invitation that allowed you to say no. A question about your life that was not secretly about getting something from you. They began learning you again. Not the person they remembered. The person you had become. And you noticed the difference. Once, they would have assumed they knew what you needed. Now they asked. Once, they would have disappeared when conversations became uncomfortable. Now they stayed. Once, they wanted forgiveness quickly because their guilt was painful. Now they understood that your healing did not exist to make them feel better. That was when you began to wonder whether perhaps the sweetest surprise was not that someone had returned. Perhaps it was that someone had finally learned how to approach you without asking you to become smaller. Still, you remained cautious. There were moments when the past reached for you. A delayed reply could make your old fears return. A quiet conversation could remind you of old silences. You would sometimes feel the instinct to protect yourself by pulling away before anything could hurt. And they noticed. One evening, you became distant. They could have accused you. They could have said you were punishing them for the past. Instead, they asked quietly, "Did I do something?" You almost said no. The old habit was to hide discomfort. But you had changed. So you told the truth. "I got scared." They nodded. Of me? Of remembering what it felt like before. They were quiet. Then they said something simple. "You don't have to trust me because I came back." You looked at them. "I know. You can watch what I do." That sentence stayed with you. Because trust is not rebuilt by insisting that someone should trust you. It is rebuilt by becoming trustworthy when nobody is applauding. Day after day. Choice after choice. In ordinary moments. That is where the real surprise was taking shape. Not in grand gestures. inconsistency. And perhaps you have wondered why your own story has felt so quiet lately. Why nothing dramatic seems to be happening. Why the things you once prayed for have not arrived in the form you imagined. Maybe because some of the most important changes do not announce themselves. They happen while you are learning to live again. They happen while you stop chasing what cannot meet you. They happen while you become comfortable with your own company. They happen while someone else is quietly learning what it means to approach you with respect. You may think a soulmate surprise has to be enormous. A sudden proposal. A message after years. A person appearing exactly when you have given up. But sometimes the sweetest surprise is much more ordinary. Someone remembers the small thing you once said. Someone notices when you are tired. Someone listens without preparing a defense. Someone apologizes without adding the word "but." Someone gives you space without making you feel abandoned. Someone comes back not to recreate the past, but to meet the person you became after it. That is a different kind of romance. It is quieter. But it lasts longer in the heart. There was one final thing the other person had not told you. You discovered it almost by accident. You were together one afternoon when they asked whether you still had the old photograph. You smiled. Which one? The one from that day. You knew exactly which one. Why? They hesitated. Because there was something behind it. Your heart stopped for a moment. You looked at them. You knew? They nodded. Not then. What do you mean? They explained. Years ago, before everything between you fell apart, they had written something on the back of that photograph. They had intended to give it to you. They never did. They had forgotten about it until recently. You asked what it said. They smiled nervously. I think you should read it yourself. They had brought the photograph. You turned it over. There, in handwriting that had faded slightly with time, was a sentence. Not a promise. Not forever. Not anything grand. Just this. I hope one day you know how deeply you were loved, even on the days I was too frightened to show you. You read it once. Then again. And something inside you broke open. Not because you suddenly wanted the past back. Because you finally understood something you had been unable to understand for years. The absence of someone's courage had never been proof of the absence of your worth. You had spent too much time measuring your value by another person's ability to love you correctly. That was never a fair measurement. You looked at them. They were crying quietly. You had never seen them cry before. I wrote that before I left, they said. Why didn't you give it to me? I was ashamed. You looked at the photograph. Are you still? They thought about it. Less. You smiled through tears. Good. Neither of you knew what would happen next. That was the beautiful part. You were no longer demanding certainty from a future that had not happened yet. Maybe you would build something together. Maybe you would discover that some doors are better left closed. Maybe love would take a different shape than either of you expected. But whatever happened, you had already received something precious. The truth. Not the fantasy. Not the version of the story where nobody made mistakes. The truth. And truth, when it finally arrives, can be gentler than hope because it does not ask you to pretend. My beloved child, perhaps this is what you have been learning too. Not to stop believing in love. Not to become cold. Not to convince yourself that you no longer care. But to stop confusing uncertainty with destiny. You do not have to chase someone to prove that the connection was real. You do not have to force a door open because you are afraid it may never open again. You do not have to spend your life interpreting every silence. If someone is meant to return to your life in a healthy way, let their actions carry the weight of that return. Let them show you. Let them become accountable. Let them learn you again. Let them understand that the person they once knew may have scars now, boundaries now, wisdom now. And if they cannot honor those things, then perhaps their return was not meant to become a reunion. Perhaps it was meant to become closure. That possibility does not make the story less beautiful. Sometimes the sweetest surprise is not receiving the person you thought you had lost. Sometimes it is discovering that losing them did not mean losing yourself. And sometimes, when two people have grown enough to meet again, love returns differently. More quietly. Without the urgency. Without the desperate need to be chosen. Without the old games. It simply sits beside you and asks, "Can we try again, honestly this time?" And you get to decide. That is what makes it love instead of longing. Choice. Not compulsion. Not fear. Not loneliness. Choice. You may still have questions. There may still be parts of your story you cannot understand. You may still wonder whether the person you love will ever find the courage to approach you. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. I will not ask you to pretend to know what tomorrow holds. But I will ask you to notice who you are becoming while you wait for nothing. Notice how much stronger your heart has become. Notice how you can remember without collapsing. Notice how you can love without abandoning yourself. Notice how you no longer need every unanswered question to have an answer before you can move forward. That is not emptiness. That is maturity. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the part of the story you can currently see, someone else is learning something too. Maybe they are discovering that love is not merely the feeling that makes you miss someone. It is the courage to become honest about why you lost them. It is the willingness to change without demanding applause. It is the humility to return without assuming you are entitled to be welcomed. It is knowing that an apology is only the beginning. It is understanding that another person's heart is not a place you can enter simply because you once had a key. You must be invited again. And if that invitation ever comes, let it come with peace. Not pressure. Not confusion. Not another cycle of almost. Let it come with evidence. With patience. With tenderness. With the quiet feeling that you are not being asked to relive the past, but to build something neither of you knew how to build before. Maybe that is why your soulmate surprise, if it comes, may not look like the fantasy you once imagined. It may catch you in the middle of an ordinary day. You may be doing something completely unrelated to love. You may have stopped looking at the door. And then there will be a message. A knock. A familiar voice. A small object returned after years. A photograph. An apology. A simple question. Would you talk to me? And your heart may remember. But this time, memory will not make the decision for you. You will. And perhaps that is the sweetest part of all. Because you are no longer the person who once waited desperately to be chosen. You are someone who has learned to choose too. You can open the door without losing yourself. You can forgive without forgetting. You can love without surrendering your dignity. You can listen without promising. You can say yes without rushing. You can say no without hatred. You can let the future reveal itself one honest moment at a time. And if the person standing on the other side of that door has truly changed, you will know not because the universe sends you a dramatic sign, but because their presence will feel different. Their words will not have to convince you. Their behavior will. Their patience will. Their willingness to hear difficult things will. Their ability to remain when the conversation is no longer romantic will. Their respect for your boundaries will. The sweetest surprises rarely arrive wrapped in perfection. They arrive wrapped in truth. And truth can be very small. A person keeping a promise. A hand reaching across a table. A message that says, "I understand." A quiet apology. A remembered detail. A returned photograph. A choice made differently this time. Years from now, you may look back at this chapter and realize that the greatest surprise was not the moment someone came back. It was the moment you realized you no longer needed them to come back in order to be whole. That was the moment your heart became free enough to recognize healthy love if it arrived. And perhaps that freedom is what makes the future beautiful. Because now, if someone comes toward you, they will not be rescuing you from loneliness. They will be meeting you in a life you already learned how to live. If they hold your hand, it will not be because you cannot stand without them. It will be because you both want to walk in the same direction. If they say they love you, you will not need the words alone. You will watch what those words become. And if they surprise you one day with something small and impossibly tender, you may smile because you will understand that the object itself was never the miracle. The miracle was the journey that made you capable of receiving it differently. So do not be afraid of the quiet season. Do not assume nothing is happening simply because nothing dramatic is visible. Life has a way of preparing people in places you cannot see. Someone may be learning. You may be healing. A conversation may be approaching. A decision may be forming. Or perhaps the surprise waiting for you is not another person at all. Perhaps it is the sudden realization that the life you thought was over is actually beginning in a way you could never have planned. You do not need to know which one yet. You only need to remain open without becoming desperate. Hope without obsession. Love without self-abandonment. Faith without demanding a timetable. And when something genuine reaches you, let it be genuine. Let it take its time. Let it prove itself. Let the person who wants your heart learn how to handle it carefully. Because you have already survived the kind of love that made you question whether you were worthy of being chosen. You do not need to return to that. You are allowed to receive something gentler. Something steadier. Something that does not make you spend every night wondering where you stand. And maybe, just maybe, that is what has been waiting for you all along. Not a perfect person. Not a perfect story. Not a life without disappointment. But a love mature enough to understand that two imperfect people can still create something beautiful when they stop running from the truth. So when the surprise comes, if it comes, do not rush to name it. Sit with it. Look closely. Listen. Notice whether peace is present. Notice whether respect is present. Notice whether the person before you is asking for access to your heart or offering you a reason to trust them with it. There is a difference. And you know that difference now. You learned it the hard way. That knowledge is not a wound anymore. It is wisdom. Maybe one day, you will hold that old photograph again. Maybe you will turn it over and read the faded words. Maybe you will smile at the person you used to be. You may even feel tenderness for the person who once could not give you what you needed. Not because what happened was acceptable. Because you no longer need to carry anger everywhere just to prove that you were hurt. You can put it down. You can keep the lesson. You can keep the love. You can release the weight. And if the person who once walked away is standing beside you when you finally understand that, perhaps they will understand too. That love was never supposed to be about returning to who you were. It was about discovering whether two people who had once failed each other could meet again without repeating the same failure. And if they can, then perhaps the sweetest surprise is not that they came back. It is that they came back differently. If they cannot, then the surprise may still be beautiful. Because you will walk away differently. Either way, you will not be where you began. You will be wiser. Softer in the places that deserve softness. Stronger in the places that once begged for permission. And finally able to understand that some chapters end because they were failures, while others end because they have completed what they came to teach. Not every unfinished story needs another chapter. But some do. And you will know the difference not by how loudly your heart beats, but by how peacefully you can breathe. So keep living. Keep becoming. Keep allowing your life to be larger than one unanswered question. If love finds you again, let it find the person you are now. Not the person who once waited. Not the person who once begged for clarity. Not the person who thought being abandoned meant being unworthy. Let it find you here. Whole enough to choose. Wise enough to observe. Tender enough to love. Strong enough to walk away if love asks you to disappear. And if someone you once loved is quietly preparing a surprise for you, perhaps they are not only preparing a gift. Perhaps they are preparing to meet the person you became while they were gone. That meeting will require courage from both of you. Because they will have to face the consequences of who they were. And you will have to face the possibility that your heart may still have room for something you thought you had buried. Neither of you can know what happens after that. Maybe there will be laughter. Maybe tears. Maybe another goodbye. Maybe the beginning of something neither of you expected. But there is something you can know. You do not have to fear the future simply because the past hurt. The past taught you how to recognize what the future must not repeat. And perhaps, somewhere ahead, there is a quiet moment waiting for you. Nothing dramatic. No crowd. No perfect music. Just someone looking at you with an expression that says they finally understand what they could not understand before. And maybe they will place something small in your hand. Something you thought was lost. Something you once stopped looking for. And when you close your fingers around it, you may realize that the sweetest surprise was never the object. It was the journey. The distance. The growing. The remembering. The forgiveness. The choice. The fact that you both had to become different people before you could understand what the old versions of yourselves could not hold. And maybe, when that moment comes, you will not need a grand speech. You will simply look at them. And they will look at you. And for once, neither of you will be trying to escape the silence. Because sometimes silence is not the absence of love. Sometimes it is where the truth finally becomes quiet enough to be heard. My beloved child, whatever surprise waits beyond this moment, do not chase it. Let it come honestly. Let love approach you without making you abandon yourself to receive it. And if someone returns, let them return with more than memories. Let them return with character. With patience. With accountability. With the courage to love the person standing before them, not the version of you they remember. And if no one returns, do not mistake that for the end of your story. Your life was never waiting for one person to complete it. You were becoming yourself all along. Maybe the greatest surprise will be a person. Maybe it will be a new beginning. Maybe it will be peace. Maybe it will be the morning when you realize that the thing you once begged life to give you is no longer the thing you need. Whatever it is, meet it with an open heart and clear eyes. Because you have learned something precious. Love can be beautiful without being perfect. Forgiveness can be powerful without reopening every door. And sometimes the most unexpected gift is not getting back what you lost. It is discovering that what you became while losing it was worth finding. So breathe. Let tomorrow remain tomorrow. You do not need to force the next page open. There are stories that become beautiful precisely because they were not rushed. And if someone is walking toward you, let them walk. If they have something to say, let them find the courage to say it. If they have something to prove, let their actions prove it. And if one day they place something small and familiar in your hands and tell you that they never truly forgot, you will not have to decide everything in that moment. You can simply receive the truth. Then look at the life you have built. Look at the person you have become. And choose from there. Not from fear. Not from loneliness. Not from the memory of what could have been. From peace. From wisdom. From love that finally knows how to remain itself even when the answer is uncertain. Because perhaps that is the sweetest surprise waiting for you. Not simply that someone may come back. But that when they do, you will finally understand that you were never waiting for someone to save you. You were becoming someone who could recognize love when it arrived gently. And this time, you will know the difference between being wanted and being cherished. Between being missed and being understood. Between being remembered and being chosen. Between someone returning because they are lonely and someone returning because they have finally learned how to love. You will not need to guess. You will watch. You will listen. And whatever happens next, you will remain yourself. That is the part of the story no one can take from you. And maybe, just maybe, when you finally close your hand around that unexpected little gift, you will smile not because everything has been repaired, but because you have finally learned that some of the most beautiful things in life arrive after you stop demanding that they arrive in the form you imagined. Sometimes love surprises you by returning. Sometimes it surprises you by transforming. And sometimes it surprises you by teaching you that your heart was never broken beyond repair. It was simply becoming wise enough to recognize something real. Something gentle. Something earned. Something that does not ask you to lose yourself in order to keep it. And when that kind of love finds you, my beloved child, you will not have to run toward it. You will simply open your hands. And let it show you what it came to give.